When people hear that I was around 160 kilos, I think it's very easy to look at the number and assume you understand what that meant. But the number was probably the least important part of it, because the hardest thing about being 160 kilos wasn't simply just carrying the weight every day. It was what was actually happening to my life around that. My confidence, my mental health, the things that I was constantly avoiding, the opportunities that I didn't take, and probably more than anything else I've mentioned so far, how small I'd allowed my life to become. Now, if you've watched chapter 1 already, you'll know where this story eventually goes. I've lost over 11 stone. I became a personal trainer and coach, and I've helped hundreds of other people change their lives. I'm now married, and today my life looks completely different. But I don't want to jump to any of that just yet, because I think this part of the story is honestly really important, especially if you're watching this and you're currently in that place where honestly, you know that you're unhappy and you know that something deep down needs to change. But like many of us, you don't really know how you're ever going to actually get from there to where you want to be. Because trust me, I've been there. It was never just about being overweight. At my heaviest around 2017, 2018, I was roughly 160 kilos. But I didn't just wake up one morning and arrive at that weight. It happened gradually. And I think that's actually a really important distinction, because when something happens gradually, you adapt to it. Things that would once have shocked you slowly start to become normal. And you tell yourself that you'll sort it out eventually, or that you'll start properly next week. You'll get yourself together when life calms down and things are a bit easier. But the truth is that months become years, and that's pretty much where I was. And underneath the weight itself, there was honestly a lot more going on. I was really struggling with depression and my mental health. I didn't have really any confidence at all. I was working in a job that didn't have any real passion for at all. And I didn't really feel like I had much direction or purpose in my life at all. And I'm not saying being overweight caused every problem that I had. I'm definitely not doing that. And I'm also not saying that losing weight magically solves everything, because again, it doesn't. And that's something I'm going to talk about much later, in more detail later on in this series. But all of those things fed into each other. When you already don't feel particularly good about yourself, it becomes honestly very easy to stop doing the things that make you feel better. And once that starts happening, your world can become smaller without you really even noticing. My life had become small. There were social situations that I would avoid. There were things I didn't want to do because I didn't feel comfortable or remotely confident in myself. Dating and relationships were affected by it. I'd become incredibly conscious of myself. And when you spend enough time feeling like that, avoiding things starts to feel safer than putting yourself actually in those situations where you may well feel uncomfortable. And that's the bit that I don't think people always understand. Because from the outside, somebody might just see a person who's overweight. They see the physical thing. They don't necessarily see everything happening underneath it. They don't see the confidence disappearing. They don't see the things you decide not to do. And they don't see how often you're thinking about yourself and how other people might see you. They don't see the conversations that you're constantly having with yourself in your own head. And eventually, you can reach a point where you're not really living life at all, and definitely not the one that you want anymore. You're just existing inside the version of life you've gradually become, a life that you've gradually become comfortable enough just to tolerate. I think that's probably one of the best ways that I can explain where I was. I wasn't happy, but I'd become used to being unhappy. I wasn't someone who had never tried. And here's another part of the story that I think really matters. I actually went to the gym. That's probably not what people expect when they see some of the photographs of me at my heaviest. But I did train. I wasn't completely uninterested in fitness. And I wasn't just sitting there thinking I didn't care what happened to me. I did go to the gym.
I did lift weight. There were parts of training that I enjoyed. I didn't properly understand nutrition. And ultimately, I wasn't addressing the biggest thing that needed to change. And I think that's incredibly relevant to the people that I coach now. Because there's this assumption that if somebody is very overweight, they must simply be lazy, or they don't care enough, or that they're not trying. And sometimes that couldn't be further from the truth. Sometimes people are trying incredibly hard. They're just putting that effort into things that aren't actually solving the problem. And that was me. I could go into the gym and train and still continue living a way outside that gym that meant my weight wasn't really changing. And because I didn't have the knowledge I have now, I didn't understand how to put everything together. Training, nutrition, calories, my lifestyle and consistency. None of it really formed one coherent plan. It was just go to the gym, try harder, and hope that something eventually changes. And when it doesn't, assume there's something wrong with you.
One of the most difficult things to explain is what repeated disappointment does to your confidence. Because you don't necessarily think, I'm going to give up. It's much quieter than that. You just slowly start expecting less from yourself. You convince yourself that this is probably just who you are. That other people can change, but maybe you can't. You'll start again at some point, and that you'll do something about it eventually. And every time you say that and nothing changes, you trust yourself slightly less. That's something I understand now when I speak to people who tell me that they've tried diet after diet. Because eventually, they're not just asking, will this diet work? They're asking, am I actually capable of doing this? Those are two very different questions. And I know what that second one,
I didn't need anyone to tell me I was overweight. This is another reason I think the way we speak about weight really matters. I knew I was overweight. Of course I knew. I didn't need somebody to point it out to me. I didn't need humiliation. I didn't need someone shouting at me that I needed to work harder. And I certainly didn't need to be made to feel worse about myself. I was already doing a pretty good job without my own. What I actually needed was a way forward that felt possible. I needed to see that changing my life didn't require me to suddenly become a completely different person overnight. Because when you're looking at a huge amount of weight to lose, the end result can feel impossibly far away. Looking back now, over 11 stone sounds like this huge transformation. But the person sitting there at 160 kilos can't really... I couldn't see the version of myself that you're looking at now. I definitely couldn't imagine that one day I'll be coaching other people. I couldn't imagine that my entire career would revolve around fitness. And I couldn't imagine the opportunities that would eventually come from changing my life. None of that existed yet. There was just me, where I was, knowing I didn't want to stay there.
It wasn't some perfect movie moment. I sometimes think that transformation stories get rewritten after the event. There's this temptation to create one dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. You've hit rock bottom, music starts playing, you decide this is the day, and from that point onwards, you're a completely different person, just like the movies. That wasn't really my experience. I didn't suddenly wake up with unlimited motivation. I wasn't suddenly confident, and I hadn't suddenly developed years of nutrition knowledge. I definitely hadn't worked out the sustainable approach to weight loss that I teach today. That came much later. My starting point was actually far less glamorous than that. My brother started doing a 10-week shred that had been put together through the gym that I went to. And I basically copied what he was doing.
I did a meal plan, and that was the beginning. Not because I'd suddenly worked everything out, and not because I had the perfect strategy. I just finally had something in front of me that told me what to do. And for someone who'd spent so long stuck, that really mattered. The first version of my weight loss journey wasn't perfect. And this is where the story actually gets more interesting. Because it worked. The weight started coming off. For the first time, I started seeing evidence that maybe I could actually change. And once you've spent years believing you're stuck, seeing that first bit of progress can be incredibly powerful. But the way I initially approached weight loss wasn't the way I would teach somebody to do it now. It became too restrictive. There were times where that restriction then led to binging. There was far too much of that mentality of needing to be perfect. I'd started losing weight, but I hadn't yet developed a healthy or sustainable way of approaching it. And that's an important part of my story, because I don't want to sit here now after losing the weight and become a coach and pretend that I've executed some perfect evidence-based plan from day one, because I didn't. I made mistakes, a lot of them, and I learned through things by doing them badly. I learned what happens when you make weight loss your entire life. I learned what restriction can do, and eventually I learned something that now sits at the center of everything that I teach. Losing weight is only one part of the problem. You also have to build a life in which you can actually keep it off. But I hadn't learned that yet. And at this point in the story, I was just beginning to realize that maybe the person I'd become didn't have to be the person that I stayed. What 160 kilos really felt like. So when somebody asked me what being 160 kilos felt like, I could talk about the weight, but that's not really what I remember most. I remember the lack of confidence, feeling stuck, and not really knowing where my life was going. I remember avoiding things rather than feeling able to actually embrace them, and believing that change was something that I needed without knowing whether I was actually capable of achieving it. And that's why I don't look at someone who's struggling with their weight and think you just need more discipline, because I've been the person on the other side of that conversation. I've been the person who knew something needed to change, who didn't feel particularly confident, and who didn't have all the answers. I've been the person who was trying, but wasn't necessarily doing the right thing. And I've been the person who couldn't yet imagine what life might look like on the other side. If you're watching this and some of what I've said feels familiar, I need you to understand something. The person I am now wasn't hiding somewhere inside me, waiting for one perfect motivational moment. I had to build him. I made plenty of mistakes along the way. 160 kilos, I couldn't see everything that was going to happen next. I didn't need somebody to tell me I was overweight. I already knew that. What I really needed was to start believing that my life could become bigger again. And eventually, that's what happened. But the first attempt at changing my life was about to teach me some of the lessons that I still carry with me now. Because starting to lose weight and learning how to live without constantly fighting your weight turned out to be two very different things. This is chapter 2 of my story, and we're only just getting started.